Okay, so let's talk about the spinal cord and what exactly the spinal cord is made up of and how they are going to contribute to overall function. So, the spinal cord is going to be an actual reversal of the central nervous system from the brain. So, while the cortex of the brain is going to contain the cell bodies, the cortex of the spinal cord is actually going to be mostly axons. So it'll be white matter, where the central cavity and the core of the spinal cord is going to be cell bodies. And that's going to be divided into two different plates, the alar and the basal plates. So the alar plate is going to be cell bodies of interneurons, and interneurons are going to be solid central nervous system cells. So their entirety will be within the central nervous system, so the spinal cord and into the brain. Whereas the basal plate is going to be the motor neurons, where the cell bodies are going to be within the spinal cord, but the axons are going to travel outside of the spinal cord and innervate muscles, glands, etc. So that is going to be the big difference. Notice I didn't even say anything about the sensory neurons. That's because the sensory neurons, their cell bodies are going to be found outside of the central nervous system. They are going to be the pseudo-unipolar neurons that are going to be found, the cell bodies are going to be found in the dorsal root ganglia, or the DRG. So the ganglia is going to be the collection of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, whereas the nuclei are going to be collections of neuron cell bodies within the nuclei. So that is one of the main differences. So the alar plate interneurons maintain their entire cell body within the central nervous system, whereas the basal plate will start in the central nervous system and actually contribute to the anterior axons. So the spinal cord will run from the base of the skull all the way down to L1, L2. There is what's known as the cauda equina, which is going to run from L2 down through the remainder of the lumbar spine, the sacral region, as well as the coccygeal region. And that's where you get the nerve roots from L1 through the coccygeal nerve. So you do still have neurons within this within the central canal of the vertebral column, but it will no longer be an entire spinal cord. It'll be a cauda equina, which is translating as the horsetail. So it looks like fibers, like a horsetail would. So this is a dog that would have a lack of communication paralysis, so they don't have the spinal cord communication from L1, L2 beyond, so their hind legs would not work or not function properly. So how is the spinal cord set up? What is different in the spinal cord than in the brain? Well, it still has the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater that we discussed with the brain, and they will maintain similar structure. So the dura mater would still be the most durable. It's the thickest layer. It will be on the outside of the spinal cord, and it will hold it in position, make sure that the spinal cord does not move too much as we move throughout the day. The arachnoid mater is going to be on the inside, and that will be the spider web extensions, which will maintain the structure for the arteries and the veins to remain between the arachnoid and the pia mater without being squished. And then the pia mater will hug the spinal cord and maintain that saran wrap-like molding on the outside as the last barrier of protection. This is going to be the most delicate and fragile layer. Okay. We're also going to have epidural space on the outside of the dura mater, and that is going to maintain this potential space so your nerves do not get squished, impinged, or irritated as you move. And as you can see, there is still CSF. There actually is a cerebrospinal fluid flow that goes through this central canal of the spinal cord. And so it replenishes and nourishes the spinal cord and the neurons to maintain the nutrient density, the ion concentration, and the oxygen flow to the nervous system within the spinal cord. So here you can see the spinal cord starts right here at the base of the skull, so around that C1, and it goes all the way down to C1, C2. You can see this term called the conus medullaris. It is a medullary cone, so it's shaped kind of like an ice cream cone would be. You have the tip at the bottom here, and then it extends and expands as it goes up just about one level, so that is at C1, C2. And after that, you just have this cauda equina, which is going to be the nerves, but it's not going to be organized like the spinal cord is above L1, L2. So you can see each nerve is going to exit underneath the lumbar vertebrae and the sacral vertebrae into the coccygeal region at each level. But the actual meat of the spinal cord is going to end at L1, L2. So all these nerves will come up in the vertebral canal and attach and innervate at the L1, L2, or above regions. Okay, so that is where you're actually going to get the injections for the epidurals. So it actually will be injected around the L4, L5 region. They go between the bones through the connective tissue and the muscles, and now you have this open space where if you go above L1, L2, this region here is actually going to be nervous tissue. So you have a little wiggle room here that you can inject a needle and not do any significant damage to the neurons. It is still possible, but is much less likely to happen in this region because you're not going to pierce a full tissue. It's more going to be injecting the into the fluid surrounding the nervous tissue. Okay. So if we take a cross-section of the neuron, as we had discussed a little earlier, you can see the white matter on the exterior and then the gray matter on the interior of that spinal cord. So this would be the exact opposite that you would see in the spinal cord versus in the brain. And of course the gray matter is going to be cell bodies, whereas the white matter is going to be axons, because you have the axons of the neurons coming from the dorsal root into the spinal cord. They're going to enter and then they're going to synapse in the gray matter on both the left and the right side, and you can see they even can cross over. So these are known as horns. So you have the dorsal horn, the anterior horn, and then you also have the lateral horn, which is going to be more for the viscera. Okay, and so each level is going to have another region of the dorsal and ventral roots. So you have a level here which would be going out, say at L4, and then in level, well, that would not be accurate, C4, C5, C6, for example, where you now have a nerve that extends out at that level to go between the transverse processes of the different levels. So when you have nerves that are coming into the spinal cord, they travel in the dorsal root, where you have the dorsal root ganglia, the collection of neuron cell bodies, and the dorsal root is going to come into the dorsal region, the posterior segment of the spinal cord, synapse in the dorsal horn with either with inner neurons that are then going to synapse with either the motor neurons, or they are going to go up or down the spinal cord to innervate with other motor neurons or other inner neurons that are going to communicate information. So the dorsal root is going to be made up of only sensory neurons, whereas the ventral root is going to be made up of only motor neurons. So these are only going to relay information to the spinal cord. These are only going to relay information out of the spinal cord to the peripheral body. Okay, and so you can see it's broken down into these different segments. So this would be somatic sensory. That's what SS means. So it's sensory information, receptors that are going to come in and synapse only for the somatic or the conscious brain. So that would be the muscles, that would be information from the skin that will relay things like temperature, touch, pain from those regions. Whereas visceral sensory, which is VS, is going to relay information from the organs. So that would be from the stomach or the intestines or the lungs. And so now you have communication into the spinal cord, and that can relay either reflexes out or just relay information up to the brain to process that information. And it's going to be the similar story with motor. So visceral motor is going to be found in the lateral horn, which is right over here. So you can see it over there. It's an extension laterally in the middle of the spinal cord, and that will relay information to those internal organs. And then the somatic motor is going to relay information to muscles, skin, etc. So those are going to be the main components, the main regions that you want to learn. So the dorsal horn is only going to be sensory, and the ventral and lateral are going to be motor. Lateral for visceral, anterior for somatic. And the lateral horn is only going to be found between T1 and L1, L2 of the spinal cord. That's where you're going to have the sympathetic innervation. And we'll talk about that more as we get through the rest of the course. But the visceral is only going to be found when you have somatic sensation or somatic motor components to the spinal cord. The rest of the visceral motor is going to come from the parasympathetic region, which will be from the cranial nerves, which we will be discussing in the next lecture. So the dorsal horns are interneurons that receive somatic and visceral sensory input from the peripheral nervous system, and those would be the dorsal horn or dorsal roots, the dorsal root ganglia, those receptors that will bring information in, synapse in the dorsal horn, and these interneurons will then relay information either to the motor for reflexes, or they'll relay information to the brain to process and decide what to do. The ventral horns are going to have some interneurons, but they're mostly going to be somatic motor neurons and axons that exit the cord via the ventral roots. So you'll get the interneurons coming from the dorsal horns, synapsing on the ventral horn, where those neurons will then send a signal out to the muscles to dictate motion of some sort. The lateral horns only in the thoracic and superior lumbar region, so that would be T1 through L1, L2, and that's only sympathetic neurons. So what the sympathetic system is going to do is create a fight or flight response. So these are going to do things like tell the heart to increase its rate, increase its strength, maybe increase blood flow to the muscles. It can increase the breathing rate, and that's all things found within the lateral horns. The cranial nerves are going to be all of the parasympathetic or rest and digest input. So dorsal roots are going to have sensory input to the cord. Those are going to be peripheral neurons. So the cell bodies are in the peripheral nervous system, the receptors are in the peripheral nervous system, and they're relaying that information into the spinal cord itself. Whereas the dorsal root ganglia is going to be those cell bodies. So that is still outside of the spinal cord and outside of the brain, and that will be the cell bodies of the pseudounipolar neurons. They send that information into the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord will relay information to either motors or to the brain. So what is the white matter? Well, white matter, as you know, is going to be the axons because it is fatty tissues. The myelin surrounding those axons will give that white color to the central nervous system. So the main orders that we're going to be looking at, or the fiber directions, are going to be ascending, descending, or transverse. So ascending would be, of course, going up. So that is going to send a signal up to the brain and relay that the information from the sensory to the brain for processing. Okay, and that would be a 3 successive neuron chain. So it would be the first order, an interneuron, then the next one would be a second order, and then the third order, which would bring the information all the way up into the cortex. There are different pathways for this, including the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. That's a mouthful, but it's going to go up the dorsum of the spinal cord, so you can see it right on here, and it's going to go into the dorsal and medial pathways, so this region on both sides, and go up into the brain, into the cortex to relay information. You can have the anterolateral pathways, so that would be over here, anterolateral on both sides, can relay pain and discomfort. Then we also have the spinocerebellar tracts, and that would be information relating from things like the reflex and Golgi body in the muscles to relate to the cerebellum to alter how your body posture is maintained. And then we also have descending pathways. So we either have a direct or an indirect pathway. So direct, as you can imagine, would be very direct. It would go directly to the motor neurons and create that reaction. Indirect would be a multi-neuron chain that can lead to several different neurons being activated. And then we have a transverse, which is going to simply be in the same level that the neurons will be entering into the spinal cord, and it will decussate or cross, or it could even just move from the sensory pathway to the motor pathways. So what are some different traumas and disorders? Well, obviously we know about paralysis. So spastic paralysis would be where you have some cut from the central nervous system. There's no communication from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system. So spastic means that your muscles can still be contracted because of reflexes, and that would be if you do your knee reflex. If you tap on your knee and you can create a very strong response, you have a neuron that will go from the central nervous, or from the peripheral nervous system, from the knee to the spinal cord. It will then activate the muscle to contract and create that knee kick. Now, that would be if there is a disorder of the central nervous system above the level of the knee. So it would have to be above the L4 region of the spinal cord. Paraplegia would be the paralysis of both of the legs, so it would be some sort of damage to the central nervous system above or below the thoracic region. The quadriplegia would be a damage to the central nervous system within the cervical region that would cause paralysis of the legs and the arms. So quad for 4, so all 4 limbs would be damaged and you would not have control over the limbs. Poliomyelitis. Now, poliomyelitis was the disorder that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had. You saw pictures of the iron lungs because people were not able to breathe, etc. Poliomyelitis is going to lead to an inflammation of the myelin that would damage the neurons. Now, it is very, very, very rare for polio to cause any sort of paralysis. It was less than 1% of cases of polio that would lead to paralysis. But of course, we had some famous people that had suffered from poliomyelitis, and it is very uncommon, if not extinct, at this moment to see any poliomyelitis, although inflammation of the myelin is still present, and that would be, you could see some forms of meningitis that can mimic the polio virus. And then ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, is also going to be where you start to destroy neurons, and that can lead to a progressive disorder of paralysis of the limbs, and it can confine people into a wheelchair where they lose their strength. There are some football players who have had this disorder, obviously Lou Gehrig as well, and that leads to paralysis, inability to function on your own, and even can lead to the loss of speech. So they now have computers that allow people to communicate with eye fields and looking at different regions of the computer screen. It's pretty advanced technology, and I don't fully understand how it works, but it has something to do with movement of the eyes to create speech. So the hypothalamus is going to be very important in this entire pathway. We're going to get really in depth on that next term when we start discussing the endocrine system, because the hypothalamus is the master control center. It's a very small region, but can lead to the creation of different hormones, and that combined with the pituitary, both the anterior and the posterior pituitary, will lead to the functioning of the endocrine system with growth, thyroid, adrenals, and even the sex hormones. So maturation is all beginning at that hypothalamus. So that is the end of the central nervous system portion. So we're going to just ask a couple questions, and then we're going to move on to the peripheral nervous system next lecture. So why is the blood-brain barrier ineffective against alcohol? Well, it's because alcohol is lipid soluble. So alcohol will easily pass through the cell membrane of the astrocytes, and that, as well as anesthetics, can pass through without having to go between the cell membranes. So it actually affects the brain pretty rapidly, and then even will affect the brain more rapidly if you combine alcohol with carbonated beverages. It leads to the alcohol being absorbed faster and traveling to the brain quicker. So the vodka tonics, the gin and tonics, etc., will lead to a faster absorption and a quicker effect on the brain itself. Okay, so we're going to get into the peripheral nervous system next lecture, so be prepared.